Welcome, welcome, welcome. So, here is this conversation about especially women and there's probably something human, but I'm going to speak directly to women for the purposes of this particular live. Although I still welcome, if you're a man watching, your questions or your experiences. But I am going to speak directly to what I believe is the experience in a woman's body. Of really this connection between our pleasure and our connection to our pleasure and power. And I was trying to write about this morning. I've been trying to create like outlines more for my lives so that they like make more sense. So before I really dive in, again, I want to say welcome. I want to say, as always, I really invite your questions. I invite your reflections. I invite your shares about your life and either how this has played out and like where you see this in your life, or where this has had some conflict or challenge in your life. Hi, Karina. I'm glad you love this topic. I love it too. So, you specifically or anyone, again, I really invite you to share how this has played out in your life, or where it's like where you bumped up against it. And again, I really want to speak. I feel like I believe that there's something really essential about this for those of us who walk through the world as women. And even so, of course, I still welcome the men who are on this to either witness or to be part of the conversation in your questions or in your shares. So I was realizing, as I said, I was trying to maybe create an outline so this would have a more like cogent structure, a more coherent flow. And one of the things I realized is that even this, like the concept of pleasure or the concept of power, like they're so big, and in some ways, so many differing maybe ideas about what that means. So I wanted to just drop in a couple things about what I mean when I say pleasure and when I say power. Specifically, power to me is yes, absolutely connected to our capacity to create in the world or to move through the world with I would say like a sense of our own self-trust, like an embodied kind of self-trust is connected to our capacity to feel pleasure. And yes, as I said, like to be able to create in the world, to actually bring forth what it is that we desire to bring forth, to I actually really don't like the word manifest, but sometimes I don't know what other word to use, but to manifest what we want to manifest in the world, to have the kind of impact we want to have in the world. Certain kind of magnetism, I would say. I'll put all of these in the sense of power. And to me, this power that actually comes from pleasure is it's almost inherently a power, like a power with instead of a power over. That there's no domination in this power. And there's room for everyone, like in the power that truly comes from, I guess I'm going to bridge right here now into what I mean by pleasure. And one of the reasons I want to talk about pleasure and why it's so important is that, and I'll talk about why I think this is in a moment, but as women, when we disconnect from our pleasure, we inherently have to disconnect from our bodies. And so this, like everything that's available here in our embodied movement through the world, we lose touch with when, if we're like, okay, well, I want to be in my body, but I don't want to feel any pleasure. And I know that that's not like a conscious decision from most of us would like to feel pleasure, but then, and so I'll talk about this in a moment. But there's so much, both where our capacity to receive and then our capacity to express or to impact that's lost when we are unwilling to feel all of our bodies, because this is the vehicle we have to move through the world. And I believe, especially as women, like our bodies, inside our bodies, have the capacity to create life, whether we choose to do that or not. And that is magic. That is literal magic. So we know all the things that happen, you know, I mean, science can now tell us about how the cells divide and like this thing, but nobody can actually tell you like what makes life. But that only happens inside, it only happens inside a woman's body. That's magic. And so this disconnection from our bodies, and again, pleasure, is we disconnect from the literal magic that we have to create in the world. Holly said, self-trust, yes, so profound. There's such a freedom in moving through life powerfully and with joy, but all of that takes work. You have such a softness about you, and I love that. Thank you. So I'll come back to that in just a moment. Thank you, Holly. The other thing that I want to say, and I'll keep weaving this through as I talk, but the other thing I want to say is that my definition of pleasure is not separate from every other experience. So it's neither all about sex or sensual pleasure, nor is it separate from sex and sensual pleasure. The pleasure that I am talking about is not something that is that like you cannot feel afraid and pleasure, or grief and pleasure, or anger and pleasure. There's not like well, I need to get through this first and then I can feel my pleasure. The pleasure I'm talking about is actually the pleasure that's inherent in all of those experiences. And part of the reason I wanted to say that is that for me, and I believe that there is a thread of truth for, you know, I always hate to make broad sweeping statements about all people or all women or all relationships, because there's always an exception. But I really do believe that the capacity and the practice, the willingness to touch on that is literally what allows me to both be, I mean, it's what I call fierce grace in a certain sense, or it's what allows me to be both very powerful and soft. And that they're not different. We see them so often, and we hold them as sort of opposing forces, or that one will detract from the other, but they don't. And so much of that actually has to do with our capacity to touch the pleasure that's inherent in all experience. So, and that is where I personally find my freedom, and where I find a joy that is there even when I'm not getting my way, or even when I'm angry about something, or even when I feel hurt. And then there's like some of this again is a practice, is actually finding the practice. But first, I think it is first, is a willingness. The willingness. And then we have to expand our capacity. Because most of us, so now I'll talk about this, most of us have shut down this capacity to feel pleasure. So what I want to say about that, so much for my plan, my nice structured outline. So here's what I believe is true. And again, if you're just joining, like, please, all your questions are welcome, all your shares are welcome, all the ways that you have found this to be true in your life, or you have found this not to be true in your life, or all of that. It's all really welcome. I'd really love for there to be the conversation. So I believe it is true that women's pleasure has been co-opted by the male gaze in our culture. And I don't mean that as an indictment of men, but like literally at a systemic level, women's pleasure has been co-opted for the male gaze. We see this not only in really obvious areas like porn, but also advertising, you know, in both like very blatant ways and then also in very, very subtle ways. But women's pleasure has been co-opted for the male gaze. And both through, again, you know, movements like feminism, which I am radically behind. Like, I'm like, hell yes to the feminist movement that has come. And frankly, all of us, if we look around, like we owe our lives. We owe our lives to the feminist movement. And inside some of those pieces, both the ways that we consciously can see that our pleasure is being co-opted for the male gaze, or that we can unconsciously feel, and we're like, no, you can't have it. There's often then like a real closing, a contraction, and a rejection of. And rather than just being like this firm stance, like, no, this will not be co-opted. It often becomes, no, I will not give that to you. I will not feel the pleasure because it has been co-opted. And what I will often say is, like, then we just fuck ourselves twice, because not only is our pleasure still being co-opted for the male gaze, but we've also really robbed ourselves of our own, like, this deep, really endless, like it's an infinite well of nourishment. And where I believe, actually, again, like our infinite, the infinite wellspring, I mean, this is where it connects to power, because of that nourishment and just life force, like an infinite wellspring of life force comes from our own capacity and first, as I said, our own willingness. Like, okay, I will allow myself, will allow this feeling of pleasure in my own body. And that comes, like, I really believe, and this has been my experience and my experience of working with women, is that they're actually, it's subtler and subtler and subtler, but it is literally available to us in every moment. So there are absolutely practices to cultivate more pleasure, you know, of actual, like, our own physical self-touch, all the way from, you know, just the pleasure, right, of my own fingers on my own skin, or my own, there's actual cultivation of pleasure in your body, all the way to, you know, regular masturbation practices, all of which I think are fantastic. And then there is, and I really believe that actually it's the weaving of these together, that often it does take some conscious cultivation, whether that's in the realm of pleasurable movement and pleasurable dance, or regular conscious, you know, pleasure practice, right? My touching my own body, my moving in a way that actually cultivates more pleasure in my own body. Woven together with, like, married with finding the pleasure that's always already there in every moment. And some of that is, it rarely, I will say this, is that rarely is that really in total stillness. That's a different kind of, but it can happen in almost stillness, right? Doesn't actually have to be in a lot of, really the cultivation of pleasure through pleasurable movement, but the willingness to feel the way that the sun coming in through my window and touching my body, or, maybe it's just on my cheek or it's just on my knee, and like, oh, but that spot feels really good, right where the sun touches. Or these moments of slowing down and taking a breath. And I have this a lot where suddenly all the bird sound like comes in, and it's like a wave of pleasure that comes in through that sense. And then subtler and subtler still is, and I've worked with women a lot on this, and it often does take a more clear container, because this is very subtle work and it can be quite confronting, but is finding the pleasure that's there even in the moments that seem like there's no pleasure, when my body might be in some pain also, or when I'm feeling sadness or anger. And I remember specifically with a woman who we'd been working specifically on her finding like the genuine pleasure in her own body. And then she had taken on, like, it was 30 days. It was the month of December. So I don't know if there's 30 or 31 days. But every day, one song. And not just dancing to it, not trying to get out of how she was feeling through it, but the choosing a song, and then for one song, like really touching in on the genuine pleasure, and then letting pleasure move her body. And through that practice, like all these pieces being unlocked. And it was after that, she and I had a conversation, and there was this piece that was still coming up about, like, in her language, I could hear, the need to like shift out of this experience. Like I was specifically around anger, and to be able to touch into the pleasure. And I remember I paused her and I was like, wait, even like, don't tell me that there's nothing pleasurable in the energy of anger. Now, the way that we contract around anger might not be pleasurable, or the fear that might, there's like fear of what I might do if in that anger, or sometimes too, I think we separate from this pleasure out of fear of what we'll do. Like, if I find it pleasurable, what will I then do? Will I just allow this, this anger, this expression to take over? And so it's not about necessarily following the train of the story or, acting on these impulses, but, in that moment too, she could feel it. Inside my own self, I know it's like, oh, there is a pleasure in the intensity of anger, like the heat that can rise up in the, the impulse. I used to have this vision of, there was someone I would get so angry at, I would like imagine pushing her down the stairs. And that was terrifying to me in one sense, and I wanted to contract around it. But I could also feel like the pleasure just in the energy of that desire without doing it, obviously. I'm going to pause on comments here for a minute. David said the power of softness and the softness of power. Absolutely. I mean, frankly, this is where I'm glad you brought that up, actually, because I wrote this note and then promptly forgot about it, which is how I think inside this cultural construct of women's pleasure being co-opted for the male gaze, that pleasure is, it becomes, like unconsciously, but it becomes synonymous with weakness. If I allow myself to feel pleasure, I'll be weak, or I'll be taken advantage of, or I'll do something stupid. Like in some way I'll be weak, rather than I'll actually then be plugged into the ultimate source of power, like in the universe. This is creative energy. This is literally the same. And again, this is where it's like, it is both about sexual and sensual pleasure, and not limited to sensual and sexual pleasure. Not getting stuck in like, well, it's not about that, but also not getting stuck in that it's all about that. And again, this is a tangent, but most women will do one or the other. So women who have maybe connected to their sensual pleasure will then want to say, okay, it's not about that. Or if, I'll talk about pleasure, and some women can find, the pleasure in eating or the pleasure in movement, but they're like, but no, like not the sexual pleasure. Like I can't feel turned on in this. Or, and then other women are more comfortable, like, okay, I can do, daily masturbation practice, but there's something about the widening out in the pleasure of all of it that it's like too much, or it's hard to distinguish that it's not just about sex. It doesn't have to just be limited to that narrow band. But this is like literally the same energy. This is the same energy that created everything. I don't even want to say the universe, because it's like bigger than the universe. It's like from this impulse, it's that from which everything was born, was created. It is this that continues to manifest the universe, like moment to moment to moment. And it's our capacity to plug into that. We have that capacity to plug into that moment to moment to moment. And there is no need, there's nothing to get over or get beyond or be different than, to have the capacity to connect to that or to plug into that in any moment. An analogy that I used, and then I'll come back to the comments, but an analogy that I used this past weekend when I was working with a group of women around embodied pleasurable movement, through, like, whenever we're going to talk about the body, it means through whatever is already there in the body. So in the body might be frustration, in the body might be sadness, in the body might be irritation or anger or fear or loss, or all these things that might be there. And so the analogy I used was like this willingness to actually bring our expression through it and find the pleasure through it is like those crystals that have many, many different facets. And it doesn't matter which facet the light shines through, it throws a rainbow on the wall. So it might shine through the facet of anger, or through the facet of grief, or through the facet of fear. But when we actually like shine, I mean, it's kind of love, but then it embodied love, I would say, is pleasurable. So when we're willing to actually express through that, find the pleasure that can come through it, it makes beauty regardless. Like there's nothing but that. I hope this is making sense. Jenny said, very difficult for women in my generation that were told pleasure is a sin for years. Absolutely. And I mean, this is, again, this is actually a place where, like, that's human, and it's generation. And then there's definitely religion that gets layered on top of that, and all these, like, that's a sin, that's bad. You're gonna, it's like, you're gonna go blind masturbating, you're gonna go to hell, I mean, man, it is like deep and dark, 100%. So what I would say to that is, is again, is almost like let the pleasure come through that, rather than I need to get through, like I have to deal with all this childhood conditioning before I can do any of this. It's like, let that actually be the path. Even I'm kind of even questioning this in the moment. So you're watching, like this is happening real time. I'm like, maybe shame is literally something that, it can't quite come through. But I do believe that there is a capacity and then there's a willingness. It actually so first there has to be this willingness, and then there's practice. There's actually bringing ourselves to it, where you could allow shame, like, oh, I'm trying to do a practice and shame comes up, and so I'm setting the practice aside. I can't do that until I deal with my shame. I believe that actually there's a capacity, and it might be easier inside like a safe container, whether that's with a therapist or with a coach, coming to a women's retreat where you do this kind of work. So there's somebody there to help you hold it, but where it's like, I'm feeling the shame and I'm going to keep just finding like the littlest bit of movement that I can do. I'm going to keep bringing breath and find pleasure in my breath, even as I feel shame. So that's my encouragement. And none of this is meant to say like, oh, this is all easy, or just like, pretend like it's all, easy, or that there's no, there's a challenge here. It really takes attention, takes intention. And absolutely, I think that there are, in certain ways, like generations where this is more challenging, or it was more shut down, or if you grew up in certain kinds of religious households, there can be real stuff to work through around that. But it can be too, and I know people who have found challenges because they grew up kind of like in a more free love hippie environment and didn't feel safe. Like this was all kind of thrown in their face too young. And so there's a part that's like, this isn't safe. And so that's both ends of the spectrum. And so I would basically say, like, we all have something to work through around this, and that is our path. And that's the willingness that I'm talking about. And then there's finding the practices and just that willingness to keep meeting the practice and keep finding the pleasure, and then keep being willing, maybe it just starts in the privacy of your own home, but it can begin to be something that ripples out. And it's not about like throwing our pleasure or throwing our sex around in an unconscious way, but it's the willingness to open to the pleasure that is coming in, and also to be willing for it to express outward in a way that, frankly, I believe frees all of us. So this construct of the way that women's pleasure has been co-opted for the male gaze, if we just like, like, okay, like that's my role, and I'm supposed to be just like full of pleasure and sexy and like no matter what, because that's the way that like I get praise and attention, and I'll be safe. That's inside that construct. But also, so is like, no, I don't do that. I'm a powerful woman. Like, you're not allowed to see me as sexual. Like the rejection of that is also inside that construct. And so the invitation I'm making is actually to step outside that construct altogether. And that is where I believe that we create an entirely new realm that is free, where we are literally creating our own freedom moment to moment. And that's real power. So I wish I could stay here all day because this is fantastic conversation, but I have to sign off in just a moment. So I want to touch in on a couple of these comments, and maybe I'll do a part 2 because this is a big topic. Emily said, ooh, I get the bird sound thing too. Absolutely. So often it's using the things that come easy to start to unlock the places where it's not always easy. So if like the bird song coming in or the sun coming in or the wind brushing your cheek, like if that's easy access, then use that to start to unlock the places that are more challenging, which maybe it's more challenging to create pleasure or to magnify that pleasure through the actual touch, like of your own body. So use the places where it comes easily to begin to unlock the places that are more challenging. Megan said, this is lovely, thank you. I've been feeling these little sensations again too. Listening, feeling, breathing, tasting the sweet air. I love that. So thank you for speaking to the need to shift out of something. Yeah, feeling is so important versus bypassing this. I'm relearning and rediscovering this. Thank you for not making this solely about sex. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. I'm glad that you see all of that. And it's really about, again, it's around getting out of the construct of either or. Like both of those are locked into the same construct. It's not all about sex and it's not about sex or sensual, right? Like sex gets limited to this tiny thing. There's just like this entire world of sensual pleasure. And there's also no reason for that not to have an interplay in our own bodies and between people, and to make that actually safe, where it's not grabbed and taken advantage of, but it's also not withheld, because that's one of the ways that it's been co-opted and misused. So thank you, Megan. I love your comments there. Amy said, more please. I want to hear more of stepping out of this construct. Awesome. Okay. Well, I'm gonna use that as the invitation for a part 2, and maybe I'll find a way to make some of this a little bit more like point by point. But maybe it's, you know, like pleasure just doesn't want to fit into like a framework. Thank you for all of those who joined me today, and for anyone watching the replay. I also welcome, you know, your questions, your comments, and I'll either bring them into a part 2 or we'll engage in the comments. And I'm just so grateful for engaging in the conversation. Have a wonderful rest of your day.